Hello, Art family. This is Mr. Park with the Principals Read Aloud. This month is Black History Month, and we'll be celebrating just by reading aloud books that have to do with famous African Americans and the impact that they've had on our country and the world. So the book that I have selected for today in honor of Frederick Douglass Day is A Picture Book of Frederick Douglass by David A. Adler. Before you listen, I just wanted to give you a heads up that some of the content in here is mature, and so you may want to preview it prior to showing it to your children. But I do believe that the story of Frederick Douglass, as well as his experiences, are valuable and worth sharing with our children, even our youngest. And so I did share this book with my first grader. She loved it. She enjoyed it. In fact, she made a connection and said, if Frederick Douglass is like Martin Luther King, he wants equal rights, right? It made me happy. Love that she's learning those pieces from these famous African Americans. So, with that said, I'd like to read aloud this book to you. Picture Book of Frederick Douglass by David Adler. Frederick Douglass was born a slave on a tobacco, corn, and wheat farm in Talbot County, Maryland. He was born in February 1818. His mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Frederick's mother was an African-American slave named Harriet Bailey. He never knew who his father was, but he did know that he was a white man. Some people said he was Captain Aaron Anthony, Frederick's first owner. Soon after Frederick was born, he was taken to live with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times after that. She had to walk 12 miles at night to see her son and walk 12 miles back to be at work by sunrise. If she was late, she would be whipped. He wrote later, she would lie down with me and get me to sleep. But long before I waked, she was gone. She died when Frederick was about 7 years old. When Frederick was 6, he was taken to his master's house and put to work. He wrote later about how he had lived as a slave. In the hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse towel linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. He was fed boiled cornmeal called mush. Frederick was awakened often by the cries of a slave being beaten. The first time that happened, it was his own Aunt Hester who was tied to a hook and whipped. Young Frederick was so frightened that he ran into a closet and hid. When Frederick was 8 years old, he was taken to Baltimore to live as a slave of Sophia and Hugh Ald, relatives of his master's daughter. He ran errands for the Alds and took care of their infant son, Thomas. Young Frederick Bailey was Sophia Ald's first slave. She was a good-hearted woman and taught Frederick the alphabet. She began to teach him to read until her husband told her that it was against the law. Hugh Ald said a slave should know nothing but to obey his master. Sophia Ald stopped teaching Frederick, but he didn't stop learning. He took a book with him when he went out on errands. Poor white boys he met in the street helped him learn to read. When Frederick was about 12, he told the boys, "I'm a slave for life." And he asked them, "Have not I as good a right to be free as you have?" Frederick read the Bible and went to a church Sabbath school for black children. When he was 14, he taught at the school. In 1833, Frederick was sent to work for Thomas Ald, Hugh's brother. The next year, he was sent to work for Edward Covey, a poor farmer known to break the spirit of young slaves. Frederick worked hard. Even so, Covey beat him about once a week. Then one summer morning, Frederick fought back, and Covey never beat him again. The fight was a turning point in Frederick's life. As Frederick's life as a slave, I was nothing before, he said later. I was a man now. On January 1st, 1835, Frederick was sent to work with William Freeland. On Sundays, the slaves had no work, and Frederick opened a secret Sabbath school and taught slaves to read. Frederick longed to be free. He and a few other slaves had hoped to escape by boat. But someone told of their plans, and Frederick was put in jail. He expected to be sold to a slave owner in the Deep South to work in the cotton fields, a fate Frederick thought of as a life of living death. But instead, he was sent back to Baltimore to be Hugh Auld's slave again. Frederick worked in a shipyard. Whatever he earned, he gave to Hugh Auld. In Baltimore, Frederick met with many free African Americans, including Anna Murray. And together, they planned Frederick's escape from slavery. Frederick planned to travel north by train, and it gave him the money he needed. A free African American sailor loaned Frederick papers to prove he was not a slave. Frederick rode 3 trains, 3 ferries, and a steamboat to New York City and freedom. Then, to make it difficult for slave catchers to find him, he changed his surname from Bailey to Johnson, and then to Douglas. Soon after Frederick arrived in New York, he sent for Anna Murray. They were married on September 15, 1838, and moved further north to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Frederick and Anna Douglas had 5 children: Rosetta, Louis, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Anna. In New Bedford, Frederick worked loading and unloading ships, shoveling coal and sweeping out chimneys. Frederick was pleased he didn't have to share his wages with the slave owner. About 4 months after he came to New Bedford, Frederick began reading The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper. He wrote later, "My soul was set on fire." In 1841, Frederick Douglass met the editor of the newspaper, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison hired him to travel to other cities, talk about the horrors of slavery, and sell subscriptions to the Liberator. In 1845, his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was published. In the book, he wrote his original name, Frederick Bailey, and the name of his master. This put Frederick in danger of being caught as a runaway slave. So, he went to England. He gave speeches there, too, about the evils of slavery. Frederick Douglass believed that people are not property to be owned by others. But still in Baltimore, the Aulds held papers proving that they did own him. Some friends in England bought those papers and his freedom. Now, he could go home. Frederick Douglass returned to the United States in 1847. He moved to Rochester, New York, and started his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. Later, it was renamed Frederick Douglass's paper. Frederick spoke out against a racial prejudice he found in the northern states. He spoke out for women's rights. His house became a stop on the Underground Railroad, a series of safe houses for runaway slaves on their way further north to freedom. On April 12, 1861, the four-year-long Civil War between the Northern Union Army and Southern Confederate Army began. It was the war that ended slavery in the United States. In 1863, Frederick Douglass helped gather soldiers for the first black unit in the Union Army. 3 of his sons joined, but Frederick Douglass soon learned that black soldiers were paid much less than the whites and were given poor equipment and little training. He told this to President Lincoln. The president told Frederick Douglass to be patient. Progress in the rights of African Americans would come slowly. 8 months after the Confederate Army was defeated, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed. Slavery was outlawed. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president. In March 1865, after the inauguration, Frederick Douglass went to the White House to shake the president's hand. At first, he was not allowed in because he was African American. President Lincoln had him shown in, and as he entered the hall, the president said, "Here comes my friend, Douglass." Several weeks later, on April 14, President Lincoln was shot. He died the next day. Frederick Douglass wrote 2 more books about his life. My Bondage and My Freedom was published in 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, published in 1881. In 1877, he was named Marshal, and in 1881, Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C. In 1889, he was named Consul General to Haiti. In 1882, Anna Douglass died, and 2 years later, Frederick married Helen Pitts, a white woman. Both blacks and whites were upset by the marriage. Helen Pitts told people that she had married the man she loved. Frederick Douglass told people that his first wife was black, like his mother, and his second wife was white, like his father. During his last years, Frederick Douglass spoke out against the mob violence and lynchings of African Americans in the South. He wrote that every Southern breeze was tainted and faded with Negro blood. And Frederick Douglass had helped lead the struggle to end slavery. He had hoped to see blacks and whites throughout the United States living together in peace. He never did. On February 20th, 1895, after attending a meeting on women's rights, Frederick had a heart attack and died. He was 77 years old. I hope you enjoyed this read aloud. And as I stated earlier, before I began to read aloud, there is some mature content in this book. I would definitely take time, if you choose to view this with your child, to take time to discuss what was read and also to answer questions that they might have. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help walk through these discussions. And happy Frederick Douglass Day.